was one of the most famous Unitarian theologians and ethicists for many, many years, and he lived to be close to 100. And he was one of my teachers for a short period of time. And I was at an event that he led, and he was on the stage and he was talking, and he said that his favorite soap opera was Days of Our Lives. And I said, oh my God, then I can be a minister too. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I've lived in South Carolina for a little bit more than 2 years, moving here in retirement after 35 years of ministry. And I came to Columbia to be near family, my sister and brother-in-law. I've never been to Augusta before, and I look forward to spending some time this afternoon exploring it a bit before going home. And if anybody knows a good restaurant that is pretty good with gluten-free, because I have celiac, I'd appreciate hearing about it. I looked at your website and I was impressed by 2 phrases in it. And I'm paraphrasing, I think, your dedication to bringing light to the world and to exploration beyond boundaries. Those echo my own personal life mission. I noticed your early and continuing commitments to racial justice, including early civil rights struggles and more recent journey toward wholeness activities. And also your completion of the Welcoming Congregation program. You know, 75% or so of our UU congregations are welcoming congregations, and you all may know that there's a new updated program that if you haven't been aware of it, you might want to take a look at it. And you guys, you have correctly seen that the spiritual and other forms of growth we search are about being on a journey. And all that came through to me from your website. Sometimes those journeys are inner journeys or journeys within a community or in partnership with other communities. Sometimes they include journeys to special places that transform our lives. Years ago in 1988, I chose to travel to a place of beauty, Cinnamon Bay in St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Have any of you been there? Well, the U.S. Virgin Islands is 95% national park. And Cinnamon Bay was a beautiful place. And I went alone and I was seeking solitude. It was the least expensive vacation I could take. I wanted to be on a personal spiritual journey. I had read a AAA book on St. John, and I learned that there would be no no-see-ums in the afternoon and wild donkeys on the pathways at Cinnamon Bay. The bite of a no-see-um leaves a powerful itch, but I found out that Avon's Skin So Soft deters them. But wild donkeys? I didn't relish the idea of running into any wild creatures on my way to the outhouse or the shower or the community restaurant. What to do? As a good UU, I respected the interdependent web of all existence, but how to embody that respect for a wild donkey? How to counter my anticipated fear? In his book, Sadhana, the late Father Anthony Mello offered meditative practices on awareness and compassion. He wrote of Francis of Assisi, who, he said, recognized in the sun, the moon, the stars, the trees, the birds, the animals, his brothers and sisters. My journey to St. John was a solitary spiritual retreat, and I brought Sadhana and one other book of his. And his exercises helped me learn body meditations for awareness. He suggested that if you were feeling fearful, resentful, angry, or hateful towards someone, when approaching that person, or in this case, that animal, you could surreptitiously tap twice in the corner of your eye while honoring the divinity within the other. It reminded me of the Namaste greeting, or my sister's favorite mantra. As I said, she would say, I love you just the way you are. I love me just the way I am. I thought I would try the eye tapping with the wild donkeys. Strangely, that simple practice of recognizing the sacredness of the donkeys stilled my fear. And over time, it opened my heart to more empathy and more compassion. As a UU, my life challenge is to grow in my capacity to respect the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, to grow in my capacity to respect the worth and dignity of every person and every being. Easier to say than to do. It's a lifelong journey, not a straight line onward and upward, but more like a spiral. It's not always easy for me to live respect for the worth and dignity of all. Sometimes we are even challenged to respect the worth and dignity of everyone in a church community. I am not alone in experiencing this. I remember one day at a UU coffee hour after a church service, during my internship at a UU Christian church, a couple of people next to me in the coffee line were talking about General Assembly. One said to the other there had been a lot of atheists at General Assembly. The other replied, well, that's not real Unitarian Universalism. At another coffee hour at a more humanist congregation, I heard the dialogue in reverse. One said there were a lot of UU Christians at GA, and another replied in almost the same words, well, that's not Unitarian Universalism. A similar message of non-acceptance, non-validation. We celebrate our unity and diversity in words and song, and we live unity in diversity well at times. And at other times, we are more challenged to live that call to a life of respect. And I am no exception. I was raised by social activist parents who persistently advocated for equality. We learned as children to accept all peoples as equals through songs we sang like "O Commodore Gray." Still, I have struggled sometimes. I have confronted my resistance directly, and sometimes there were moments when facing it has been thrust upon me. Where I lived and served my first congregation in Keene, New Hampshire, there was a young man who traveled around the Keene community by wheelchair. He powered it by his own leg movements, his arms sometimes gesticulating wildly as he made his way on a sidewalk bordering the very wide main street. I crossed the street more than once to avoid greeting him. I was afraid I would not know how to greet him or how to talk to him. I had not yet learned about tapping the corner of my eye 2 times. The Keene congregation was considering whether to build a ramp. And they said, well, we don't have anybody in wheelchairs, so why should we do it? And I, believing in my mind, if not always in my heart, that people who were handicapped were equal, said, exactly. And the congregation built the ramp. And then one day, that same young man that I had seen on the sidewalk wheeled himself up the ramp and got through the door and asked to speak to the minister. And so I came out of my office, my heart in my mouth, and I greeted him. And I learned his name. And then Tom and I went into the sanctuary, which is where I started getting to know him. He had cerebral palsy from the time of his birth. I learned that, and I learned that he was smart. In the subsequent years, he graduated from college despite his challenges. Tom had difficulty with relationships. He loved Unitarian Universalism, and he loved our congregation. He was voted to be a member of the board. He went to a General Assembly and wheeled himself to the mic at the front and spoke on an issue before the assembly. And my respect for those who are other than me moved yet another step forward. My compassion for those who are other than me grew another inch deeper. Our third principle urges us to grow in spirit, each in our own ways, and to accept one another. We UUs don't have a theological or a spiritual creed, and in many congregations, if we were honestly to share our beliefs and practices with one another, we would realize how diverse we are. I created a spiritual pluralism project in 2 of my congregations to encourage growth in our varying paths and also dialogues amongst each other. That helped break through prejudices some of the members had between the UU humanists and the UU Christians and the UU Buddhists and the UU earth-based folk. And sometimes when they would speak to me, some of them, and say, you know, I realize now that any one sermon can't satisfy every one of us, but having these small groups helps me to come to church on a regular basis. But in some UU congregations, we don't acknowledge these differences. I witnessed that when someone in one of my congregations spoke from the pulpit as if we are all humanists. We say we are diverse, but in some congregations we act as if we all share the same theological perspective. And in many congregations, we fail to speak about that incongruence. And that is like an elephant in the room of our spiritual communities. Well, you knew I'd get the elephant in there somehow. And sometimes we speak as if we have a political creed, as if we are all Democrats or socialists. These assumptions can leave some folks feeling excluded, which brings me to the donkey and the elephant. We are a pluralistic religion. Our principles proclaim this pluralism, and we are embedded in the context of a pluralistic nation, both spiritually and religiously. But our national pluralisms are not experienced in the light of the biblical vision of lions lying down with lambs, or the political vision and hope that our nation become less polarized. We are deeply divided. That polarization affects us all and hurts some of us more than others. We have seen that damaging polarization most recently in the events related to the Supreme Court nomination. And we have also seen a moment when that polarization has been bridged, a moment of potential hope. Our nation's founding principles embodied in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution declare that all shall have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and justice, and all shall be free to practice our own religions or none. The Constitution intends in its purpose to promote the general welfare, not just for some, but for all. As a nation, we have overcome obstacles to expand some rights, the right to vote, for example, and the right of reproductive choice. And more recently, though, many of our nation's leaders have profaned the truth of the Constitution by voting to restrict these rights. We are a pluralistic nation, but forces of fear, hate, non-acceptance of the other, racism, and greed are pulling us apart rather than affirming e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Our donkey party and our elephant party are more deeply divided than ever and are exacerbating that polarization. And one of the commentators on a cable network recently acknowledged that the cable newscasters and commentators are also deepening the divisions. I think we need to practice new ways to communicate about our divisions and perhaps about our differences in congregations too, so that we can learn more fully how to be accepting of one another. In this century, can we learn how better to find common ground and accept others who disagree with us without demonizing? I have worked with Organizing for Action groups for several years in Chicago and in Bozeman, Montana, and now in Columbia. Organizing for Action has tried to change the conversation about contentious issues like climate change and gun violence. Gun violence is increasing in Columbia and in our nation, and responses to it unearth some of the most deeply rooted polarizations we face. A friend, Alexandria, who became a fellow in the OFA chapter, which I lead, has a vision. Alex and another fellow, Janice, partnered in the vision. They created a presentation that would bring together people in faith communities and local organizations that are acting to reduce gun violence. They brought Moms Demand Action, the Faith Coalition on Gun Violence, and the Carolina Peace Resource Center and other groups addressing this serious societal issue that impacts so many lives. Alexandria also attended a weekend program on alternatives to violence to learn better how to use respectful and meaningful conversation to help people find common values and work together to find viable solutions. So bringing together people with differing ideas for respectful, honest conversation is in keeping with our Unitarian Universalist values of respect for the worth and dignity of all people. And it exemplifies the ideas of the late Henry Nelson Wyman, a 20th century UU thinker who wrote about what he called creative interchange. Wyman believed that if we share our ideas with honesty and respect, and we listen to and respond to others' ideas with appreciation, honesty, and respect, not just waiting for what we're going to say in response to them, but really listening to them, we will be able to build upon each other's offerings and come to a creative, higher, and deeper truth. When our differences become rooted in identity, as political differences and ethnic and religious ideas can be, they can be sorely intractable. But do they need to be? The great majority of gun owners believe that there should be sensible gun regulations. If Alexandria and Janice find folks in a few congregations who might not all think or all feel the same about guns, who can be in that kind of conversation and who might be able to learn about ways to make a difference, is that not worth a try? Maybe some of those gathered folks would be Democrats and maybe some of them would be Republicans. Maybe they would form coalitions diverse in ways social and political, but agreed that something more must be done. Maybe this hypothetical and hoped-for coalition of people wanting to do something would sit together in a row at a hearing at the South Carolina State House and let their voices be heard. Gun violence hurts and kills people. It might have caused suffering to some of us, possibly to those we love or people we barely know or don't know at all. Is it not worth the effort to learn and practice better ways to share and hear the stories and ideas of others, and to learn better how to disagree without demonizing? One time, flying back into Bozeman from a trip east, my seat partner and I got into a conversation. I didn't know him, but I learned he was coming both for business and for hunting. Somehow we got involved in a discussion about climate change. I don't remember how it came up. He said he was very skeptical that it was real. By then we had talked about his love of nature and both of our families. I mentioned how the mountain animals were having to travel further up the mountain to get their food because of the warming. I said, well, suppose it is real. Might it be worth trying to reduce our carbon if it could make a better, more livable environment for our kids and our grandkids? I asked him what he thought, and he paused for quite a while. And then he said, maybe so. He said, I'm going to think more about that. Perhaps that conversation between a climate change activist and a climate change skeptic might have planted a little seed. Oh, Commodore Gray was wont to nurture the relationship building of his dogs and cats. I wonder if he had a thought as to their worth and dignity and the sacred center or soul that resides in each. Did the wild donkeys I met on the St. John pathways give a second to recognizing my worth or dignity? Did they know they were part of the interdependent web of life of which we are a part? This much is true. We can know that they are, and that we all are parts of that interdependent web, all creatures of worth and dignity. Building relationships with like-minded people and also with those who hold different perspectives, practicing the arts of conversation, sharing respectfully and honestly, listening with respect and appreciation, discerning common values, acting together for good where we can. These are efforts worth making, are they not? Such efforts may not always yield good fruit, yet some may. Such efforts would, I believe, teach us much, even when the effort fails. And taking the chance and making the efforts might help us all nurture seeds of hope. So may it be. Blessed be. Amen.